I'm just going to free-form a lot of this. Hopefully, I had the world's best slide. It was a great idea. It included text from an email from Lou about what we were supposed to do and talk about how awesome we were. So my heart dropped a little bit when we saw that same slide already. But great minds think alike, obviously. So you know what the structure of the talk is going to be. I'm going to try and hit some of those key bits. I'm going to talk quickly just about what I do now, where I am. Then I'll reverse back, kind of get to where we came, or how I got to where I am. I'm going to actually just say something really quickly just about models, I think. And then I just wanted to show a few examples of simple models. I'm kind of a simple models for a simple guy sort of approach. Some simple models that I've done to answer questions that I'm quite interested in. Maybe some of you are as well. And then open it up to advice. But I've gotten an extremely wide variety of questions over the past day and a half about what I do, how I do what I do, all that kind of stuff. So hopefully there will be time for questions. Just ask questions in the middle as well. If this talk gets completely derailed because people have questions, then we met the purpose of the talk. So feel free. So quickly, right now, I have a position as a scientist for Microsoft Research, which is a blue sky research organization. It's the largest corporate research organization in the world. We've got labs in 8 countries. No, not 8 countries. We have 8 labs around the world, make up of about 1,000 PhD scientists. Most people, I am an anomaly in more ways than just this, I guess, but there's not 1,000 computational ecologists running around Microsoft Research. Most of them are people that you'd be more likely to expect: computer science, computer vision, probabilistic programming, algorithms, machine learning. So, but even things like machine learning were like kind of poo-pooed 10 years ago, right? And now we're desperately hiring as many top ML people as we possibly can. So the idea of what technology corporations should be investing in is constantly changing. By the way, I'm not the only person here. Jake, what's his name? Jake LaRiviere is a professor in the economics department, and he's joining us in Microsoft Research as well. So our interests are wide and varied, and environmental science and ecology happens to fit that, both because we have a lot of money and we think we should invest in this space, quite frankly, because we think it's a large societal issue, but also because the types of problems, models, and data that you guys are all working with on a day-to-day basis are actually fairly unique. Very large heterogeneous data sources from sensors on plants and animals in harsh, uninstrumented locations. You actually are unique. That's not what most data science is about, right? Most data science is about figuring out how to make an ad predictor for what people are going to click on or something. It's a very constrained environment. You've got somebody there. You're collecting data about them. You can fit very specific models to these specific instances. You guys can't do that, as we've been seeing through all the questions that you've been asking. And not only that, but ecology's always been at the forefront of statistical innovation, right? Ecology and biology. And the fact that people can stand up in front of you and talk about the Bayesian hierarchical modeling that they're doing is just kind of in a very blasé sort of way. You guys probably are getting quite used to that. Again, you're very unique even in the analytical sciences. Ecology really is kind of at the forefront of what's going on here. So my position is affiliated with a group called Computational Ecology and Environmental Sciences, where we like to say we work on the science, policy, and tools and technology to build predictive systems or predictive models of environmental systems. And that's kind of where I am, and we can come back in the question-answer session to talk about that a bit more. I run the conservation side of things, So sorry, this is our mission statement: build predictive models of ecological systems, crucial global challenges like biodiversity loss, climate change, food security. My background is in ecology, my undergraduate degree and my graduate degree, both, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I kind of run the conservation side of stuff, and this is a very small subset of the topics that I'm interested in and have published papers on, but they're really kind of core of what keeps me interested and why I do what I do. And I didn't used to think of myself this way, but the amount of interest that I had in Drew's talk, that we just intellectually listening to him speak, made me realize that this really is true. I'm increasingly interested in the computational approaches to how we address some of these challenges. That wasn't always true, and I have no background in that. So, sorry, there's a leftover slide. Right, so let's back up in time. This didn't used to always be so. That was more normal. And because I am the guy who took the path less traveled, I thought I'd just go through kind of who I am and how I got to be where I am. So I grew up in a tiny town in northern Wisconsin, hunting and fishing, and just basically getting lost in the woods all the time. And I've always loved animals and being outside. I was not a good student whatsoever. My friends, to this day, the only argument they actually have about me is if I'm the dumbest smart person they've ever met or the smartest dumb person. So I was mildly interested in school, but more interested in being outside and in sports. I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I had the exceptional good fortune, of being able to go to a university like that for in-state tuition. I think universities, public institutions in this country are an amazing, amazing thing that we do as a society. So I had the exceptional good fortune of going to Madison, and I just kind of was wandering around, kind of majoring in biology, because that's kind of what you're supposed to do if you're going to be a doctor or something, I guess. For a while, I thought I was going to go into pharmaceutical sales, because I was interested in the most money for the least amount of work. Anyway, if you're looking, banking's a good one as well. I thought you had to take more math for banking than you would have to go into pharmaceutical sales. But one day, I had to take a course as part of my general education curriculum in the zoology department that also had wider societal implications. I can't remember what the curriculum actually stipulated, but so I took this course called Extinction of Species that was taught by a guy named Stan Temple. He was one of the founders of the field of conservation biology, an early president of the society. And I remember I went into that class, I showed up 20 minutes late, kind of sulked in the back seat and prepared to not pay attention. And it was the first time anybody had ever really kind of spoken to me about what I wanted to do, the things I was interested in, that I could actually do it. I mean, here was this guy up in front of me, standing up there, who seemed to be like a esteemed professor, basically just talking about the life that I wanted to have. And so I paid attention, and I went up to him afterwards, and I said, how do I do this? And like most professors, you have these random crazy people come up to you. And he kind of humored me, and he said, well, first step, join the wildlife ecology department, come and talk to me. And I think he expected never to see me again. The next day, after bothering deans and whatever to switch everything at about 5 o'clock on a Thursday, I showed up and I said, right, I'm here, I'm ready, let's go. And I think that kind of took him back a little bit. And I hesitate to say he took me under his wing because I more kind of forced myself under there. But he did. And this gets back to one of Carlos's points, and we'll get back to it at the end, but the amazing ability of mentors to help you succeed, shape your life, and kind of find what you want to be. Stan was the first one for me, not necessarily a life mentor, but he was the first academic mentor for me. And when you look back, academic success really is about, unfortunately, a network effect called the rich get richer. And, the earlier that you can decide what you want and find the people that are going to be motivational and beneficial to helping you achieve that, those who want you to succeed as much as you want to succeed, that's a critical step in your career. For me, Stan was one of those people, and he really had my back as I was applying for research grants as an undergrad, and I got them. I hesitate to tell people about this because then they go out and they do random internet searches and find embarrassing videos of me. But I used to be, kind of still am, into snakes. I really wanted to grow up and be a famous herpetologist. If you asked me the guy that I wished I was at the end of the day, it would be a guy named Harry Green, who is a well-known herpetologist. And so I did a bunch of undergraduate research projects, cut my chops kind of writing small proposals and grants as an undergrad, did 2 summers of field work, catching snakes in southeastern Wisconsin, a state-threatened species threatened with development in Milwaukee, and started to get interested in things from there. And because I was interested in what I was doing, suddenly school didn't seem like very much work, and things came extremely easy to me. So I had a fair amount of academic success because suddenly, I just wanted to spend my weekends reading these books and doing these problem sets. That sounds cliched, but for me it was true. And then the two big things happened for me. I was trying to decide what to do next, and Stan suggested that I start thinking about graduate school. And sometime around then, my wife and I were randomly, well, she wasn't my wife at that time, we're kind of wandering down State Street in Madison, talking about what we should do with our lives. And she said, well, I kind of want to go into the Peace Corps, which, mind you, we'd been together since we were 14 years old. So, and she'd never mentioned this before, so who knows the other thing she's hiding from me. But so I said, oh, I didn't know that about you. But hey, I don't have anything better going on, so let's do it. And so we applied for the Peace Corps, and my wife said, the Peace Corps doesn't let you choose where you want to go or what you do, but they do give you a negative option. They say, tell us one place you don't want to go, one thing you don't want to do. And I think they do that to screw with you, actually, because my wife said, well, I really don't want to go, I mean, broadly speaking, this was before a lot of life experience. My wife said, I don't want to go to Africa, whatever that means, and I don't want to do healthcare. Okay, so we got our assignment for Malawi, and she was a healthcare volunteer. And so we quickly got married because Peace Corps won't let us go together unless you're married. It's the quickest way to divorce, generally. The statistics will show. But we bucked that trend. We surprised all the statisticians. So around that time, I said, well, how does one go to graduate school, Stan? And he says, well, you apply, and it's helpful if you kind of have money to go, because then everybody's like, well, yeah, sure, free money, why not? So I looked around, and I said, well, how do you get free money to go to grad school? And I found this thing called the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. And I said, that's great, Stan, I'm going to apply for that. And he was like, well, son, and I was like, well, you know what? Like, I've never taken no for an answer. So I spent a lot of time and wrote this amazing proposal about snakes. And I didn't hear from them. And one day I was in the wildlife ecology department checking my email, and I got this email from the NSF, and it said, oh, the awards have been announced. You can go to this website. And I was like, oh, I really don't want to do this. I did, and it was about 8:30 on a Friday morning, and I remember just running, screaming down the hallway to Stan's office. I think he thought I was absolutely berserk. And then I think he really thought I was crazy when I told him that I'd gotten an NSF, right? Because he was like, you would not get one. But I did, and those two things were the Peace Corps and the National Science Foundation were amazing support mechanisms for me to achieve what I wanted to achieve. The NSF's great because it's 3 years of funding over 5 years. So I deferred my award for 2 years, and we went into the Peace Corps. I worked for the Department of National Parks and Wildlife. What's that? You can't.
You can. You can defer, but you have to be the goal.
Really? Well, anyway. Don't take my advice. So at the time, it was amazing because you could defer this grant. And went into the Peace Corps, and Stan was right. When I started emailing people and said, hey, I have an NSF, and I'm really interested in your work, nobody said no. It was crazy. I mean, academics are as selfish as you might think they are. So nobody even wanted to see my resume. They were just like, how much is the NSF again? Does that come with overhead? So, you know, I was lucky in that I had a lot of different choices, and I had a lot of time sitting in a grass-covered mud hut in the middle of nowhere to think about where I wanted to go. I worked for the Department of National Parks and Wildlife in the middle of a beautiful place. Behind me is a place called Nika National Park. It's a 3,000-foot grassland plateau in northern Malawi with elephants, some of the highest leopard diversity, the highest orchid diversity actually in the world. It's an absolutely amazing place. The Brits used to love it when they colonized Malawi. That's where they would always go, because if you've ever been to the Lake District of the UK, it looks identical, only there's elephants, and it's very disconcerting. And then just down about 10 miles away was a place called Vwaza Marsh Game Reserve, which is a tsetse fly-infested hippo place. And so having this juxtaposition of two extremely, to me, new ecological systems was hugely fascinating to spend time with, working with communities in the outside of the reserve. And so that's what I did, and I was trying to decide where to go to school. And a guy that I had been considering going to school with was a guy named Stuart Pym at Duke University. So I'm pretty sure all of us, except maybe one or some, Duke plays a significant role. The Duke Mafia is here to tell you everything. And one of the reasons I chose Duke, we were looking for places with strong universities for my wife to pursue her higher education, as well as for me. And so Duke obviously has a lot of great schools around as well. And Stuart, who became my PhD advisor, flew me from Malawi to South Africa, to Pretoria, where he spends a lot of his summers doing field work, to meet me. So this is the guy, only I probably hadn't bathed as recently as I had in this picture, that he met off the airplane in Pretoria. And the first thing, I'd never met the guy before in my life, and was thinking about doing my PhD with him. And I got off the plane and introduced myself, and he didn't even introduce himself. He just said, "Cut your hair." And I said, well, all right, if that's the way it's going to be. But we got on, and it wasn't just the fact that he's kind of crazy that drew me to him. He wrote a book called The Balance of Nature that, for me, was hugely formative in my academic thinking. It was a book, if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend. He's written other books. He would probably want you to read those as well and cite them. Yeah, Lou will laugh at that joke. But The Balance of Nature, for me, was the strongest book, and still is, at linking strong ecological theory with applied conservation biology. And that's really what I wanted to do during my PhD. So I went to Duke. I had 3 years of NSF funding, and I did not want to be a broke PhD student. So I set to work, and I did my PhD in 3 years, from 2006 to 2009. If you want to know how to write a dissertation, I had about the world's easiest dissertation. I stapled 6 published papers together and turned them in, and they said, what are we going to do about it? So they let me go. But in those 3 years, I showed up at Duke without ever, I didn't have a TV, computer, anything growing up. I got my first computer my senior year in undergrad and then promptly had to leave it behind because I moved to Malawi. So I showed up and I desperately wanted to do field work. Desperately. That was what I thought I was meant to be, a field biologist. I wanted to go back to southeastern Africa and study large animal populations there. And Stuart said, absolutely not. You know what you're doing in the field. You grew up doing this. You've had extensive experience. But it's obvious you have no idea what you're doing when it comes to anything computational. Maybe quantitative, yeah, you're not an idiot. But computational, you don't know what you're doing. And if you're going to be successful, you need to. So he refused to let me do field work. And I buried myself in my office for the next 3 years, teaching myself as much as I possibly could. And this was right when R was really starting to take off. And so that's how things happened. From there, I took a postdoc. I split my PhD in two. I was extremely unsuccessful in merging ecological theory and conservation biology. I was successful in doing a PhD in both. Unfortunately, my PhD title was something like Dynamics of Ecological Networks and International Conservation Impacts, or something like that, which my committee wasn't exceptionally pleased about. As part of that, as part of the Food Web's ecological networks stuff that I'd done, Microsoft Research had hired a guy named Rich Williams, who also became an important part of my life. If you've ever heard of Neo Martinez or Jennifer Dunn, Rich Williams, they're one side of a large research effort in ecological networks. And Rich was interested in the stuff I did. I came to Microsoft and about 6 months later pulled the old, this was as a postdoc, pulled the old switcheroo on them and decided that I didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to do conservation biology. So they didn't hire a conservation biologist, but then they decided not to fire one. So I did a year of a postdoc there, started applying for academic jobs, and they hired me. So full-time? Oh, yeah. So there's me and my wife. Oh, sorry. So I haven't finished that. I was just anxious to get to the next slide. So anyway, so I went to the UK for 4.5 years, did my time, as I would say, and recently transferred back to corporate headquarters, Microsoft Research in Redmond, outside of Seattle. So just getting settled there. So that's me. We can talk about more if you want. It's obviously my favorite topic. But what I wanted to talk about next was just the overall idea of kind of modeling and what we're trying to do here. Because I've been hearing questions and people saying everything from, I have my statistics, or I have my master's in statistics, to I have a data set and I want to analyze it, right? And I've heard about these models, right? So there's a lot going on in this room and the needs and desires of what people want to achieve. So I just want to kind of step back a little bit and say, well, what is a model and why do we want to do anything with them, right? And so I think oftentimes, generally, people that are saying, I have a data set and I want to analyze it, they kind of have this look in their eye that tells me what they're imagining is something like this, right? And they don't really know what it is, and they know it's kind of scary, and there's a lot of math involved and statistics, and they don't really know, right? But in my mind, like I said, I think, what is that equation for? I don't know. I did know. It's in my notes. Yeah, anyway, I should have, yeah. It's for something. It's for something simple, actually. But remember, because the point is supposed to be that this is actually a model for a simple system. I can't remember what it is. But let's skip that and go to the fact that point again, which is that a model is really just a substitute for a real system, right? We're just trying to simplify something that we don't quite understand and see if we can match up our output with what we think we see in real world, right? And models can be conceptual, they can be statistical, they can be mathematical. I mean, I have the craziest conversations with people when they're telling me about a model, right? And I'm like, oh, what is it? And they show me a graph, and I'm like, that's not a model, right? But it is a model in their domain. That's what they mean by model. We have mouse models in biology. We have all sorts of things, right? It's just a substitute for a real system. What we're generally talking about here are statistical and mathematical models, okay? So why do we model? Let's see if I can, how do I actually start this? Okay, so this was a video shot. There's something called the Royal Society Lectures in the UK for school children. So you guys obviously aren't school children. You know what's going to happen here. But it's kind of funny anyway to watch the looks on their faces. But this is when people ask me just kind of in general, why do we model? It's because we can do things like this, right? Once you have a strong understanding of a system, right? And you guys know what's going to happen, like I said, but these guys don't have that model in their head. They don't understand. And what's interesting is one of these is actually his kid, which probably puts a whole new spin on it. So this is a guy named Chris Bishop. He wrote the book, Pattern Recognition. He's one of the foremost machine learning experts in the world. He's a distinguished scientist at Microsoft Research. But what's funny is we knew what was going to happen, right? He knew what was going to happen, but he's still yeah, anyway. So I think we'll get back to this, but models only take you so far. And then there's a belief system underneath that. But we don't all pull bowling balls back to our head and let them go every day just to prove things. But we do this every day. We drive in cars. We fly in planes. We use strong models to make us allow actionable predictions, right? So Chris Bishop, that's that guy's name, he didn't die because we have a strong body of data, theory, and experiments that gives us near predictive certainty about what was going to happen in that. It's not 100%, right? That dude, on the other end, could have just given it a little nudge, right, and really surprised the hell out of Chris. But in that case, we would have said, well, whoa, that's not our model, right? So life happens outside of models, right? But if the model holds true, then you can take really strong actions on some of these predictions. And so from an environmental standpoint, that's interesting, right? Because we're also doing this every day, right? Ocean acidification, deforestation, CO2 emissions, species extinctions. We're pulling that bowling ball back and we're letting it go with no model whatsoever for what's going to happen. And for me, that's kind of terrifying, right? And so for physics, we have these things that we call laws, right? And laws of inertia, motion, gravity. What do we have in ecology? We struggle, right? I'm not saying it's as simple as physical systems, but we struggle to have those same predictive models with actionable certainty when the potential ramifications are so large. So for me, why do we do models in ecology? It's to allow us to get this kind of certainty about these kinds of systems. I think we're a long way off from that, by the way. Okay, so I'm just going to transition. I don't know, how long have I actually been talking? 50 minutes? Okay, so I'm going to transition a little bit just to run you through a few simple models that falls under kind of a part of my research domain. We published a paper on this recently called What We Know and Don't Know About Earth's Biodiversity. I use few simple models to figure out both what we know and what we don't know. So, and this bit of the talk is kind of split up into how many species are there, where will we find them, what will they look like, are we prioritizing places correctly, are we successful, what about traits, and all of that. So, this really is one of ecology's oldest questions. And in a lot of ways, it's one of its most boring, right? Who really cares about how many species there are? We'll get back to whether or not you should care. But what we do know is that we have an extremely incomplete catalog of life on Earth, okay? So we know of about 1.5 million species. Estimates are all over the place. You've heard of guys like Bob May, for instance, that have created some of these very high estimates. And pretty much any time that you publish a paper, maybe this is selfishly why I decided to go into this, anytime you publish a paper in this domain, it's going to get into a good journal because people like it. But this is a paper that was co-authored by a good friend of mine, just that has a nice table in it showing that in Animalia, we're cataloged a little under 1 million. We'll get into how they made these predictions in a little bit, but we're pushing 8 million. So in total, we're talking about somewhere between less than 1.5 million known species, with probably an estimate closer to 9 million species on Earth. So there's a lot. There's still a lot more to discover. And what I want to talk about are some of the simple models and how these numbers are getting produced. Okay? So like I said, this has a very long history in ecology. Some people from this department in early days have made some of these predictions. Some people at Duke and probably some at your universities as well. And they kind of fall into what I would call 3 broad categories of modeling or extrapolations, right? First is macroecological patterns. I mean, you guys can read this, so I don't necessarily have to. But where you can go from a frequency of known known species to less known smaller species, right? So we know kind of how many large species there are. We can build these ratios. We can do ratios from well-sampled temperate regions. So we know, for instance, generally how many trees there are in North America, how many species of trees there are in North America. Good luck in South America. But we might be able to build extrapolation ratios. Species area ratios, same thing. Host specificity, so for instance, we can say, well, we should go and shake a bunch of trees and say, well, how many beetles are only found on this species of tree, and then say, well, how many species of trees are there, and come out with extrapolations like that. I don't really do any of that, so we're going to ignore it. And then there's this last one, and this has been getting a lot of attention over the past 5 to 10 years, which is trying to build models to extrapolate from taxonomic patterns. So time species accumulation curves, we'll look at this next. Catch per unit efforts, this is something that I've been heavily involved in. And simply just analysis of expert estimation, to go and ask taxonomists, hey, how many species, you've been doing this for a long time, how many species do you think are left? So the most popular one is something called time species accumulation curves, and they might work until you get into the sensitivity of some of these, fitting some of these functions, and find that probably it's a little bit more sensitive than you think in the first place. But so for instance, birds, there's about 10,000 species of birds on Earth. How do we know this? Because birders are crazy. Raise your hand if you know a birder. Right, these people are nuts. How many of you are birders? Yeah, all right, yeah. One guy raises his hand proudly, and the other one's kind of like, no one's looking, right? Like, yeah, exactly. So, and birders are crazy, and they will travel to the ends of the earth to see the latest little brown job, right? LBJ, and they will fight each other. They'll sabotage each other's trips, whatever. But these are true stories, man. But what that means for us as environmental scientists, that's great. These guys are out data collecting. They're the earliest citizen science data collectors, right? That's amazing. So we have a very good idea of how many bird species there are. We don't have all of them. Even with all of that intense effort, we don't have all of them. So we're still discovering about 5 new species per year. And of course, they're lumping and splitting species and making friends and losing friends in the process. And it's not impossible to discover completely new species, right? So Fenwick's antpitta was discovered in 2011, kicked off this international scientific controversy over naming rights and money, and it was ridiculous. But mammals, we don't know as much about mammals, but we're approaching a fairly complete knowledge base. I say fairly. So we're getting about 25 new mammals per year, we're getting some stuff that you're like, really? Like new dolphins and a new carnivorous mammal. There's I can't remember the name of this species, but it's one of the cutest things in the world, just got discovered like last year or something. But the problem, so you can, just go off and fit. These are fairly standard statistical techniques to fit that curve and estimate where it will, where the slope of that will reach 0, right? And so we can say, I don't know, there's about 10,000, there's probably about 10,500 or something like that before that line just completely plateaus. So that's fine maybe if you want to estimate how many birds there are, but we kind of know how many birds there are. So that technique only really comes in handy after the fact, right? But we don't know a lot about a lot of the rest of Earth's biodiversity. So there's a lot of insects, right? There's something like, there's crazy numbers of estimates of insects. I mean, you've all heard this. Some professor of yours has stood up and said in a very like baritone voice about, that J.B.S. Haldane was reported to have said at high table that the one thing he knows about God is that he has an inordinate fondness for beetles, and the punchline there is, right, there's so many beetles that if there's a God, he obviously was obsessed with them. But it's not just beetles, right? If you look at arachnid spiders, this is the graph of cumulative number of spiders that we've described over time. So good luck fitting that, right? Good luck trying to estimate where that is going to. It's infinity, if you want to know. But it's obviously not infinity. So you need new methods to back out and figure this out. Yes. So, which is a problem. You know what's interesting? I use this slide all the time in talks. And like half the time, people ask me that question. And half the time, they're just like, Anyway, either they just don't want to ask the question, or they're just like, it looks good to me. What?
Could you maybe in the future put like a line where like genetics started to come in, where like the genetic analysis? That would,
So one thing we don't want to have a conversation about is all the crazy stuff that's going on and how species are being described. But there's a lot of complications. Yeah. Anyway. Okay. Yeah. So there. That one, you're in like the top 10% of people that have asked. So. Yeah. I'm just trying to see. The problem is the longer I linger on it, and then you're going to be like, "Wait a minute, that's not even a spider." Yeah. Yeah, don't do that. Yeah, by the way. So this was a great paper that came out. I don't believe a word of it, but it's a great paper, and co-authored by a good friend of mine, and who did his postdoc at Microsoft Research when I was there. And they had this really nice insight from simple models, right? And they said, well, one way we might be able to get around that species curve. I can't fit this cumulative curve with any statistical model that will give me a rational leveling off point. But look at this here, right? This is the total number of phyla. And this is the total number of classes. And this is the total number of orders and families and genera. Well, we might be able to fit those, right? Maybe genera will get a little bit iffy, but phylum, we can definitely fit that with these saturation functions. And then, if you make a magical assumption that kingdom is to phylum as class is to blah, 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 and put this on a double log scale, you find that these dots, genus, family, order, class, phylum, fall almost perfectly linearly in double log space. So then you say, well, if I assume that there is a structured order of which these are equidistant on some arbitrary axis, and I say, well, species is next, then hey, I can fit that linear function, and I can extrapolate to species. Perfect. And that's where they get this number from. What's that? They don't do subspecies. What about them, or? Oh, it's not my assumption. This is why I don't think. This is why I think this is all magic. Why is it? Because I think what species are what we're getting to, and everything else is a human construct of how we. I mean, species is a human construct as well, but it's a different kind. These are more like each other than these are, right? And the idea that there's an equidistant function on the x-axis is kind of crazy. But on the either we're very good at creating a hierarchical cataloging system which I think is true, or it's a perfect prediction of how many species there actually are. Okay. Anyway, that came out in PLOS Biology. Don't criticize me for it, because I didn't write it. So I got interested in trying to more understand the mechanisms behind how species are being discovered, and thinking about catch per unit effort models, for instance, of saying, well, in fisheries, right, this is stuff you learn in undergrad, that policymakers thought, hey, what's the problem? Like, catch is remaining constant, and then boom, we fall off this catastrophic cliff with cod populations, for instance. Well, what happened with cod populations is that, yes, catch remained constant and effort was going up like this, right? So here's effort that's going up, and which one's catch per vessel, catch per unit is going down, right? And so that's the bit that they missed back in these early systems of trying to manage these fisheries. And we really screwed stuff up, right? I mean, cod kind of ruled the world, and a lot of the major fisheries still have never recovered. And it's because we missed this fact that effort was going up while catch or outcome was remaining constant. So I thought, well, maybe we can do this from a species perspective, where taxonomists are out there just kind of catching species, right, as they work harder and harder. So here's cone snails, birds, mammals, amphibians, spiders, and plants. And I think I got the axes right. This is the year. And this isn't cumulative. This is the total number that we've been catching over time. And here's the cumulative. And here's the number of taxonomists that have been working over time. And one thing, if you want to figure out ways to learn R, it's to try and do all of this stuff together, right? So how do you estimate how do you count how many taxonomists there are? Well, you scrape Web of Science, you get all the papers, you do this, and then you've got to do text parsing, and you've got to blah, 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 and you're doing it everything from modeling to web scraping to text parsing, all in one script. So, and let's look at efficiency. So this is the percent of generalists. These are the percent of generalists that were ever general or are at least now general. And that means they've ever described a species outside of the genera that they first described a species in. So it's kind of like looking at a professor's variety of their work, right? Maybe somebody's a dynamic forest modeler and they've never published anything outside of that. Or maybe he or she's published a couple papers there, and then they published a couple papers on epidemiology, and then they published a couple papers on this. So I would call that person a generalist. So the story for efficiency, are taxonomists becoming more efficient, is a little less clear. So there's a lot of reasons why they might be becoming more efficient at their jobs, that it's easier per unit effort for a taxonomist to describe a species, right? There's way higher access to resources, online databases of what species. They can more quickly compare with taxonomic catalogs to ask whether this is a new species or not, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a lot of reasons why they might be becoming less efficient. So there might just be an increased burden of reporting. It used to be like you'd write something on its leg, you'd throw it in a catalog, and you'd write a short note in Acta Zoologica or whatever. And now, there's a lot more that's going on, including molecular barcoding and this and that. So we thought, right, we're going to come up with a model. It might be wrong, but let's just see if it kind of works. And then we'll talk about whether or not it works for the right reasons. So effort is, we are saying effort is the number of taxonomists that there are. We're saying efficiency is a function that we're trying to estimate. We're saying it's going to go linearly up through time. It's probably not right. So let's see if we walk through this. So actually, a guy named Drew Purvis, who overlapped with Kiona in Princeton during his postdoc, taught me this, and I really liked it. Which is saying, when you write a model down, color code parameters and data so that it's kind of clear what's going on, right? And I thought, hey, that's kind of cool, so I did. But anyway, so we've got a fairly simple model here where we're saying that there's an amount of effort, which is the total number of taxonomists, it's being scaled by a linear function of increasing effort. So we're saying taxonomists are getting better. We don't know how much better they're going to get. We're going to try and estimate that. And then it should be getting more and more difficult to find species as there's fewer and fewer out there, right? So this is kind of the like bobbing for apples sort of problem. So here's the total number of species we know to date as data, number of taxonomists that we know as data, and the year since the start of the data. And here's the total number of species that are being found in each 5-year period. And critically, what's interesting for us is that there's a total number of species, which we're trying to estimate as a parameter. If you fit that model, this is the this is the number of species found in 5-year intervals. Black is data, red is model prediction. This is the cumulative number of species. This is the number of taxonomists working, right? So you see this same kind of increase. And here's our species per taxonomist going down. Kind of the data are noisy, our model isn't, but it's following the trends. So how do you know if you're right? Well, you never do, right? And you can wait 200 years and then see if you're right. You can backcast and see if you're right, but we've done that. Another thing you can do is go and ask taxonomists, expert taxonomists, how well they think, or how many species they think there are, and see how well your model estimates match up with taxonomic expertise. So we did this for flowering plants. So we predicted an increase of about 17% in flowering plants. And if you take the average across all these families of flowering plants that taxonomists estimate, it's almost 16%. So we're kind of on the way there. So that doesn't, I'm going to skip through this because I've only got 5 minutes left. But we started doing the same stuff to think about where these species are going to be found. Because the one thing I never mentioned is I actually don't care how many species there are. I have no interest. I'm not even intellectually curious about the topic. What I am intellectually curious about is whether or not it matters that we know. And so one of the reasons it matters is because I do like making pretty maps. I think these maps are pretty. These are made by a colleague of mine based on all the IUCN range maps. And we use these sorts of maps to figure out where we're going to prioritize conservation interventions. So like biodiversity hotspots, which most of you have heard, they're huge in the conservation world. They have garnered a lot of the money. The paper by Norman Myers is one of the most highly cited papers in ecology, and they're kind of a big deal. There's also things like the Convention on Biological Diversity, which wants to figure out where to set aside places to protect 60% of plant species, and they also want to protect 17% of the area. So people like me got interested and said, well, can you even do that? Can you protect 16% or 60% of plant species and 70% of area? You guys just made this up and like never asked whether or not you could. So we fit a bunch of greedy and genetic algorithms to try and put the world together in different ways to ask if you actually can. And it turns out, yes, you can. You can get 86% of plant species within 17% of the area, and you can actually get 67% of species endemic to 17% of the world. So that's great. You're like, well, hallelujah, right? What's that? Yeah, so yes, which is where the biodiversity hotspots parts comes in, which is they actually take into account the level of degradation of that land. But really important, this is where the number of species comes in. So Sandy Knapp says, she's a prominent plant ecologist, if these hypothetical lists do not represent complete inventories or complete phylogenies, then any measure of value of using them for conservation planning is useless, right? And it's a fairly valid point, right? So you're prioritizing the world based on this small fraction of what we know is actually out there. You could be completely wrong, right? So, but that's a standard statistical question, which is just, is the sample representative of the population, right? So how do you ask that? Well, you take the population, you know where they live, and then you predict how many. You take the sample, you know where they live, you try and predict where the new ones are going to live, and you ask whether or not those are different things. In this instance, from a geographic trait perspective, they're pretty much where we know species are going to be found, which unfortunately is principally in biodiversity hotspots, so highly imperiled landscapes. is where we already know they're going to be found. So we're not screwing up too much on this one. However, for everything else, and this is the what's interesting for me coming up, for everything else, I think we're completely wrong, right? We still have a lot of things to find. So for instance, orchids. Orchids are really well known. I mean, we made a Hollywood movie about orchids, right? And about how crazy people are. But there's about 3,500 species of orchids. We've discovered almost 1,000 of them in the last 15 years. But what's interesting about these 1,000? They're not the orchids that you think of. They're not the orchids that they made the orchid thief about. They're tiny little pleurophthalids with no flowers or flowers that you can't even see that nobody cares about. And so what you think orchids are, when you look at the large, showy flowers, are not what orchids actually are from a biodiversity portfolio perspective. That's the same true with body mass in mammals, right? If you look and you say, well, body size distribution by year, mammals are getting smaller and smaller, right? So if you look at that cumulative distribution, it's the same. It's also true for all sorts of traits about animals. And this is important when trait-based ecology is starting to take over the ecological modeling paradigm. So, you know, they're almost always smaller. You still find some big stuff. But generally, these are the stories you hear about in the news, right? Here's some toad that lives in an extremely xeric landscape. It lives in one pool in one part of, I can't remember where, Borneo. There you go, that's why I wrote it. You know, or a chameleon that's smaller than your fingernail, right? And there's still a lot more of these to be found, which is going to fundamentally change the way we view the distribution of life on Earth. And I find that fascinating. Cryptic species, one of the reasons that we're going to be finding them is because they're cryptic, both cryptic in that they look like each other, but also cryptic in that they come out at night. They're difficult. We haven't found them because they're not easy to find yet, but there's a lot more of them. And that's going to fundamentally change, like I said, the way that we think about life on Earth. So does it matter if we know how many species there are? Well, there is a basic curiosity. The public loves this stuff. I'm not really motivated by it, but that's not, you know, that's fine. But for geographic locations, at least it looks like our conservation efforts are being put in the right place. But for a lot of other stuff, I mean, we just invested 5 years of funding building something called the Mattingly model at Microsoft Research. It's a cohort-based model that's being fed by massive database of traits that we've spent years collecting to put together. It's an individual-based model in that we have individuals growing, eating, dying, having sex, reproducing, metabolizing, blah, 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 dispersing. But we're feeding them with a distribution of traits from what we know. And we know that that distribution is wrong. So should I trust the outputs of that model? I don't know. And the stuff that I'm working on now is, well, how do you discover more traits? You either collect species-blind trait data, you just walk around and do DBH, or you embrace novel ways to expand effort. And that's the stuff I'm doing with some active learning and machine learning and citizen science networks. So advice. I probably don't have time for advice, but.
Oh, go ahead.
OK. So really quickly, everything that I said, am going to say, everybody's already said. So it's not that big of a deal. But critically for me, just ask the questions you want to know the answers to. Like everything that I've been talking about, I wanted to know. Like that's what I've been wondering. And it keeps me motivated. Somebody didn't say, hey, you should do this. I'm like, all right, fine. Like I want to know the answer to that. Do things yourself from scratch, at least in the beginning. Write your own code. Don't just implement somebody's library. Like sit down, take the time to try and figure out what's actually going on. I like that because I like to be self-taught. But don't be afraid to teach yourself. You don't need to take courses. You need to understand stuff. So figure out the best way that you're going to do that. Find someone who can teach you the way you can be taught. There's however many people in here, there's that n minus a few less of the number of ways that people need to be taught. There is not one way that one statistics professor is going to reach every single one of you. Figure out the way you need to be reached, and then reach out to the person who can teach you that way. That might be your buddy in your lab. It might be somebody completely outside of the university, whatever. Find mentors. Everything about any success that I've had is because of mentors that I've aligned myself with. And for me, always feel uncomfortable. Like as soon as I feel like I kind of understand something, it's time to do something else. Probably because I don't really understand it, but I think I do. But I just want to be constantly trying to feel uncomfortable. And then I don't really know what this means, but I was reading a New York Times article that I would recommend all of you read called Why a Harvard Professor Has Mixed Feelings When Students Take Jobs in Finance. And he's talking about finance and the finance industry as rent-seeking, which isn't the way I really read this, though, which is while finding gold has value, finding gold before someone else does is mainly rent-seeking. And for me, I was thinking about that of, well, what is the thing you should be doing? If you don't do it, is somebody else just going to come along and do it better? You just managed to do it a day earlier? Like, that's kind of unfulfilling. Think of the thing that the world wouldn't have if you hadn't done it, and do that. Anyway, thank you.